Throw her out, the white CEO said without looking up. People like her don't belong in my restaurant. The words sliced through the polished dining room so cleanly that even the soft piano music seemed to lose its courage. Crystal glasses stopped clinking. Conversations faded into uneasy silence. Every server froze with trays balanced in trembling hands while dozens of wealthy guests quietly turned toward the center of the room. Naomi Carter remained perfectly still. She was 29 years old, dressed in a neatly pressed black and white server uniform, her name tag catching the warm glow from the chandelier overhead. She neither argued nor lowered her eyes. Her calm expression somehow unsettled the room more than anger ever could. Across from her stood Richard Whitmore, the white CEO of Whitmore Technologies, one of the fastest-growing manufacturing companies in Illinois. At 53, Richard carried himself with the effortless confidence of a man who believed every room belonged to him the moment he entered it. His tailored navy suit fit with military precision. His silver watch reflected the dining room lights, and every employee in the restaurant knew exactly who he was before he ever introduced himself. Richard had spent years building a reputation for demanding perfection. Investors admired him. Business magazines praised him. Employees feared him. Tonight, however, his attention wasn't on billion-dollar contracts or quarterly earnings. It was fixed on the young black waitress standing quietly in front of him. Just minutes earlier, Richard had ordered an extremely expensive bottle of vintage Cabernet from the restaurant's private cellar to celebrate a merger scheduled for the following morning. Naomi had apologized politely and explained that she could not serve that particular bottle because the restaurant manager had placed a temporary hold on it while verifying a storage issue discovered only moments before. She had offered 3 equally prestigious alternatives, each worth hundreds of dollars, each recommended by the restaurant's sommelier. Most customers would have appreciated the honesty. Richard heard only refusal. In his world, money erased obstacles. I didn't ask for alternatives, Richard said, his voice low enough to force everyone nearby to listen harder. I asked for service. Naomi kept her hands gently folded in front of her apron. I'm sorry, sir. I can't authorize something that hasn't been cleared. I'd rather disappoint you tonight than risk serving something that isn't guaranteed to meet our standards. Her answer was calm, respectful, almost gentle. Somehow that made Richard even colder. His jaw tightened as several executives seated beside him exchanged uncomfortable glances. One attempted an awkward smile, hoping to ease the tension, but Richard simply stood from his chair. The movement echoed through the room louder than anyone expected. Then you're in the wrong profession, he said. If you can't give customers what they ask for, you shouldn't be serving customers at all. Naomi felt dozens of eyes settle on her shoulders like invisible weights, yet her breathing never changed. She glanced once toward the restaurant manager, who looked trapped between protecting his employee and protecting one of the city's most influential businessmen. The silence stretched across the marble floor until it became almost unbearable. Finally, Richard reached into his jacket, placed several crisp $100 bills on the white tablecloth, and spoke the sentence everyone in the room would remember long after dessert had been forgotten. You're finished here. By tomorrow morning, someone else will be wearing that uniform. Naomi looked at him for one quiet second, then slowly removed the order pad from her apron pocket and placed it gently on the hostess stand beside her. Without another word, she turned toward the employee hallway, disappearing behind the swinging kitchen doors while the entire restaurant watched her leave, completely unaware that less than 12 hours later, the balance of power in every one of their lives was about to change forever. The heavy kitchen door closed behind Naomi Carter with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than the humiliation she had just endured. The familiar warmth of simmering soup, fresh bread, and roasted herbs wrapped around the kitchen, but none of it reached her. Cooks paused for only a heartbeat before returning to their stations. Years in the restaurant business had taught them that dignity often disappeared faster than steam above a hot skillet. Naomi quietly untied her apron and folded it with careful hands, smoothing every wrinkle as though respect for her work did not depend on whether anyone else noticed. Her manager, Daniel Brooks, stepped into the narrow hallway outside the employee lockers. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of a decision he clearly hated. He held a white envelope, but could not bring himself to extend it. Naomi, he said softly, I tried. She offered him a small smile that carried no bitterness. I know you did. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Richard Whitmore called the owner himself. He said if you stayed, he would never bring another corporate event here again. Naomi nodded once. You have a business to protect. Daniel lowered his eyes. You have always been our best employee. She reached for the envelope without looking inside. The amount printed on the final paycheck did not matter tonight. She thanked every cook as she walked toward the back entrance. One dishwasher quietly wished her luck. Another server hugged her for a brief second before returning to the dining room. No dramatic farewell followed. Life inside restaurants never stopped moving. Orders continued to arrive. Glasses continued to sparkle beneath expensive lights. New customers walked through the front door without ever knowing someone had just lost her job in the hallway behind the kitchen. Outside, the cool Chicago evening carried the scent of rain drifting across Lake Michigan. Streetlights reflected across the wet pavement in long ribbons of gold. Naomi walked toward a modest gray sedan parked near the alley, her comfortable shoes tapping gently against the sidewalk. She opened the driver's door and placed the folded apron carefully on the passenger seat instead of throwing it aside. For several quiet seconds, she simply sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel. She was not crying. She was remembering. 8 months earlier, the board of the International Holding Company had offered her a confidential leadership assignment unlike anything she had accepted before. The project required complete anonymity. The executives wanted an honest picture of how managers treated employees when they believed no one important was watching. Titles would be hidden. Positions would be ordinary. Every observation would remain confidential until the final report reached the board. Naomi had agreed without hesitation because she believed culture could never be measured inside conference rooms alone. It had to be discovered in break rooms, loading docks, kitchens, elevators, and quiet conversations after closing time. Working as a waitress had never been beneath her. It had been part of the mission she personally requested. During those months, she had learned every employee's name, celebrated birthdays in cramped staff lounges, helped new servers memorize menu items, and watched which leaders earned respect without demanding it. Tonight, she had received one more answer than she expected. Richard Whitmore had not recognized character because he never believed it could arrive wearing a server's uniform. Naomi started the engine as the dashboard clock turned to 9:42 p.m. Her phone remained silent beside the center console until its screen suddenly illuminated with a single incoming message from the chairman of the holding company. The meeting has been confirmed for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Everything is ready. She read the message once, locked the phone without replying, and slowly guided the car into the quiet stream of city traffic while the lights of downtown shimmered ahead like a horizon preparing to reveal a completely different morning. Richard Whitmore arrived at Whitmore Technologies before sunrise, just as he had for nearly 20 years. The downtown Chicago skyline shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive suite, painted in shades of pale blue and silver as the first light climbed above Lake Michigan. He preferred the building before everyone else arrived. The quiet made him feel in control. His leather shoes echoed across the marble floor while the aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted from the private lounge beside the boardroom. He loosened his tie, opened the folder containing the merger documents, and allowed himself the rare satisfaction of believing everything had gone exactly according to plan. The incident at the restaurant had already faded from his mind. To Richard, employees came and went every day. One waitress more or less made no difference to the world he understood. His executive assistant, Melissa Grant, stepped carefully into the office carrying a digital tablet. Her expression was unusually restrained. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore." He accepted the tablet without looking up. Schedule. The board meeting begins at 8 o'clock sharp. The investors? Already confirmed. The acquisition team? Melissa hesitated for a fraction of a second. They landed late last night. Richard smiled confidently. Excellent. By lunchtime, this company will officially begin its strongest quarter in history. Melissa nodded politely, but she did not return the smile. She had spent the previous evening reviewing confidential emails marked for executive distribution only. Most of them had arrived after midnight. None had been shared with Richard because the sender instructed that every announcement would be delivered during the board meeting. Richard interpreted the silence differently. He believed the holding company simply wanted to make the ceremony more dramatic. Across the city, Naomi Carter stood inside a quiet hotel suite overlooking the Chicago River. Gone was the simple waitress uniform neatly folded inside her garment bag. Instead, she adjusted the sleeve of a tailored charcoal business suit while the morning sun reflected softly across the polished wood floor. The transformation appeared dramatic only to people who had never known who she truly was. She had not become someone different overnight. She had simply stopped hiding the position she already held. On the desk rested a leather portfolio containing months of handwritten observations. Every page described leadership without mentioning titles. She had documented how managers greeted maintenance workers, how executives spoke to receptionists, how supervisors reacted when no clients were watching, and how ordinary employees treated one another under pressure. There were stories of generosity that deserved recognition. There were stories of quiet integrity hidden beneath modest uniforms. There were also moments that revealed arrogance powerful enough to poison an entire organization. Richard Whitmore's name appeared more than once. Naomi closed the portfolio and slipped it into her briefcase. Her phone rang softly. Chairman William Harper spoke with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions worth billions of dollars. "Are you ready?" he asked. Naomi looked through the window toward the skyline where the headquarters tower reflected the morning light. "I am. The board has reviewed your findings. They were unanimous." "Then today is not about replacing people," Naomi replied. "It is about changing the culture before it destroys the company from the inside." Harper smiled on the other end of the line. "That is exactly why you were chosen." The call ended. Naomi picked up her briefcase and walked toward the elevator. At almost the exact same moment, Richard straightened his jacket before the mirror inside his executive office, completely unaware that every assumption guiding his confidence was about to collide with a reality he had never imagined. The clock above the reception desk quietly shifted from 7:59 to 8 o'clock as two elevators, beginning from opposite sides of the city, started carrying their passengers toward the same meeting that neither of them would ever forget. The executive boardroom occupied the entire top floor, surrounded by walls of glass that reflected the bright Chicago morning like polished mirrors. A long walnut conference table stretched through the center of the room, already lined with bottled water, leather portfolios, and digital tablets displaying the company's logo. Senior executives filled their seats one by one, exchanging confident handshakes and quiet predictions about another successful year. Richard Whitmore entered last, exactly as he preferred. Several directors immediately stood to greet him. He accepted every compliment with practiced confidence, believing today's meeting would formally celebrate the expansion he had spent years pursuing. Melissa Grant quietly placed the final agenda in front of him, but Richard noticed something unusual. His own name no longer appeared beside the opening presentation. Instead, a single line read, "Leadership Transition and Cultural Integration." He frowned for only a second before assuming the holding company had simply revised the schedule. At precisely 8 o'clock, the boardroom doors opened once more. Chairman William Harper entered with 3 members of the parent company's executive committee walking behind him. Every conversation stopped instantly. Harper smiled warmly as he reached the head of the table. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on such short notice." Richard nodded confidently. "We are honored to have you here." Harper returned the greeting before placing both hands on the conference table. "As all of you know, yesterday evening our acquisition officially became final. Effective immediately, Whitmore Technologies is now part of Harper Global Holdings." A quiet round of applause echoed through the room. Richard joined in without hesitation. Everything still matched his expectations. Harper continued, "Our board spent the last 8 months conducting one of the most comprehensive leadership evaluations in our company's history. Financial performance remained important, but numbers alone do not build organizations that last. We examined character, accountability, humility, and the way every employee is treated, regardless of title." Several executives exchanged puzzled glances. Richard folded his hands, convinced the remarks were simply ceremonial. Harper looked toward the closed doors. "Please welcome the executive who led that evaluation." The room turned in unison. The doors opened slowly, and the sound of measured footsteps crossed the polished floor. Richard lifted his eyes almost absent-mindedly, expecting another senior executive in an expensive suit. Instead, The color slowly drained from his face. Naomi Carter walked into the boardroom carrying the same leather portfolio she had closed only an hour earlier. Her charcoal suit was elegant without being extravagant. Her posture was calm. Her expression remained exactly as it had the previous evening inside the restaurant. Composed, steady, impossible to intimidate. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. One vice president blinked repeatedly as though trying to understand what he was seeing. Another quietly looked from Naomi to Richard, then back again. Richard's fingers tightened around the edge of the conference table. His heartbeat suddenly sounded louder than the silence surrounding him. This was impossible. Less than 12 hours earlier, she had been wearing a waitress uniform. Now she walked confidently toward the head of the boardroom beside Chairman Harper, as though she belonged there more naturally than anyone else. Harper smiled as Naomi stopped beside him. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce Naomi Carter, Executive Vice President of Organizational Transformation and, effective immediately, your new Chief Executive Officer." No one moved. Even the city traffic far below seemed to disappear beneath the crushing weight of the announcement. Richard stared at Naomi without blinking, searching desperately for an explanation that refused to appear. Then Naomi finally met his eyes. There was no triumph in her expression, no anger, no desire for revenge, only quiet professionalism, the same calm dignity she had carried while standing in a restaurant dining room the night before. That silence unsettled Richard more deeply than any accusation ever could. No applause followed the announcement. The silence inside the boardroom settled like winter frost across polished wood and glass, leaving every executive uncertain whether to speak or simply breathe. Richard Whitmore remained standing beside his chair, his confidence dissolving beneath the reality unfolding only a few feet away. The image from the previous evening refused to leave his mind. He could still see Naomi wearing a neatly pressed server uniform beneath the restaurant lights, calmly accepting humiliation without raising her voice. Now she stood at the head of the table, holding authority that no one in the room could question. Chairman William Harper gently motioned toward the empty seat beside him. "Please, Naomi." She thanked him with a slight nod before placing her leather portfolio on the conference table. The room watched every movement. There was no dramatic flourish, no display of power. She simply opened the portfolio and looked around the table with the same composed expression she had shown every customer during months of quiet service. "Good morning," she began. Her voice was steady, warm, and clear enough to fill the room without demanding attention. "Over the past 8 months, I have worked under several identities inside companies owned by Harper Global Holdings. Sometimes I answered telephones. Sometimes I stocked inventory. Sometimes I served meals. Every assignment had one purpose: to discover how leadership behaves when titles disappear." Several executives lowered their eyes. Naomi continued, "Financial reports tell us whether a company is profitable. They do not tell us whether people feel respected. Balance sheets measure revenue. They cannot measure dignity." Richard swallowed quietly. Every sentence seemed directed at the entire room, yet each word landed heavily on his own conscience. Naomi slowly removed several folders from her portfolio. Each carried a different department name. "I also documented extraordinary examples of kindness," she said. "Maintenance employees who stayed late without recognition. Supervisors who quietly paid for a co-worker's medical treatment. Receptionists who comforted families during emergencies. These people represent the future we want to build." Faces around the table softened. The atmosphere shifted from fear toward reflection. Then Naomi paused. Her fingertips rested gently on one final folder. Unlike the others, it remained closed. "Unfortunately," she said quietly, "I also witnessed moments that revealed something very different." Nobody moved. Even the air conditioning seemed unusually loud against the silence. Richard knew, without opening the folder, that his name waited somewhere inside. Chairman Harper folded his hands without interrupting. Naomi looked around the room before speaking again. "Leadership is never tested during celebrations. It is tested in ordinary conversations with people who cannot improve your career." Those words struck Richard harder than any accusation could have. For the first time in decades, he replayed the restaurant scene from someone else's perspective. He remembered the frightened manager, the uncomfortable silence from nearby guests, the employees who had quietly looked away. Most of all, He remembered the sentence he had spoken with absolute certainty. People like her do not belong here. The memory no longer sounded confident. It sounded small. Naomi finally opened the last folder. Richard instinctively tightened his grip beneath the table, expecting public humiliation. Instead, Naomi surprised everyone. She closed the folder again without reading a single page. The details inside these evaluations will remain confidential, she said. Our purpose is not to embarrass individuals. It is to improve an organization. Several directors exchanged relieved glances. Richard slowly looked up. Naomi met his eyes for only a brief moment before returning her attention to the room. There was no satisfaction in her expression, only quiet resolve. Chairman Harper smiled faintly, recognizing exactly why the board had chosen her. Richard felt something unfamiliar settle inside him, heavier than failure and far more difficult to ignore. It was the realization that the woman he had dismissed as insignificant had protected his dignity at the exact moment she possessed every reason to destroy it. The board meeting ended without the usual wave of confident conversations that normally filled the executive floor. Chairs slid back quietly. Leather portfolios closed with soft clicks. One by one, the directors left the room carrying more questions than answers, their reflections drifting across the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bright Chicago skyline. Morning sunlight poured through the glass, washing the polished conference table in warm gold. Yet the room somehow felt calmer than before, as though the building itself had taken a slow, steady breath. Richard Whitmore remained seated long after everyone else had disappeared into the hallway. For the first time in decades, he had nowhere he urgently needed to be. The city below continued its familiar rhythm. Yellow taxis moved through downtown intersections. Commuters crossed sidewalks with coffee cups in hand. Construction cranes reached into the clear blue sky. Everything outside looked exactly the same. Yet inside Richard something had shifted in a way he could not ignore. He loosened his tie and quietly looked at the empty chair where Naomi had been sitting only minutes earlier. He tried to remember every detail from the previous evening. Her calm voice, her patient explanation, the respectful way she had offered alternatives instead of arguments. None of it had sounded defiant. She had simply been doing the right thing. Somehow he had mistaken integrity for disrespect. The realization settled heavily across his thoughts. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. Melissa Grant stepped into the room carrying a small cardboard box. "Your personal files from the executive office," she said softly. Richard looked at the box before offering a faint smile that lacked its usual certainty. "Thank you, Melissa." She hesitated near the doorway. "May I say something?" He nodded. Yesterday, when everything happened at the restaurant, several employees heard about it before the evening was over. Richard lowered his eyes. Melissa continued carefully. "People watch leaders more closely than leaders realize." She did not wait for a response. With quiet professionalism, she left the room, closing the door gently behind her. Richard sat alone once more. His gaze drifted toward the cardboard box. On top rested a framed photograph taken nearly 15 years earlier on the day he first became chief executive officer. He looked younger then, more hopeful. Beside him in the picture stood his late father, wearing an ordinary mechanic's uniform with grease still visible on his sleeves. Richard slowly picked up the photograph. His father had spent 40 years repairing heavy equipment in a small shop outside Springfield. He had never worn an expensive suit. He had never owned a corner office. Yet he had taught Richard one lesson over and over throughout his childhood. Respect is the one thing that costs nothing and returns everything. Richard closed his eyes. He could almost hear the old man's steady voice above the distant hum of downtown traffic. Somewhere along the road to success, he had remembered ambition but forgotten humility. The office suddenly felt much larger than before. The leather chair that had always represented achievement now felt strangely ordinary. Sunlight reflected across the glass wall, illuminating tiny dust particles floating quietly through the air. Richard watched them drift without purpose, thinking about how easily people became invisible when others decided their uniforms defined their worth. Down the hallway, Naomi paused briefly outside her new office before entering. She looked through the same windows toward the city stretching beyond the river. Her reflection appeared beside the skyline, calm and thoughtful. She knew changing a company's culture would require far more than one difficult meeting. Policies could be rewritten in a day. Trust would take much longer. She placed her portfolio on the desk, opened the blinds a little farther, and allowed the morning light to fill the room completely, believing that every lasting transformation always began with the simple decision to see people clearly before judging who they were. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the executive floor, turning the glass walls into mirrors of gold and amber as the city settled into its steady rhythm below. Hours had passed since the board meeting, yet an unusual quiet still lingered throughout the headquarters. Employees walked the hallways with measured voices, aware that the company had entered a new chapter. Inside his former executive office, Richard Whitmore slowly packed the last of his personal belongings into the cardboard box Melissa had left beside his desk. A fountain pen, a crystal paperweight engraved with the company's original logo, the framed photograph of his father. Each item seemed lighter in his hands than the thoughts weighing on his heart. There was a gentle knock at the open door. Melissa stepped inside once again. "Mrs. Carter would like to see you when you are ready," she said. Richard looked surprised. "Now?" Melissa nodded. She asked, "If you would come to her office before you leave for the day." Richard quietly closed the box. During the short walk down the hallway, he noticed details he had ignored for years. He passed the maintenance employee polishing the marble floor and offered a quiet thank you. The older man looked genuinely surprised before returning a grateful smile. A receptionist stood to greet a visiting family with warmth that often went unnoticed by executives rushing toward meetings. A young intern nervously organized files outside the legal department, carefully making room for everyone who passed. None of these people had changed since yesterday. Only the way Richard saw them had begun to change. He stopped outside Naomi Carter's office. The nameplate on the door had been installed only an hour earlier, its brushed silver letters catching the afternoon light. He took a slow breath before knocking gently. "Come in," Naomi answered. Her office felt remarkably simple for someone holding such authority. Fresh flowers rested beside the window. Family photographs shared space with leadership books and neatly organized reports. There were no oversized displays of status, no extravagant decorations, only quiet order. Naomi stood as Richard entered. Neither spoke immediately. The silence carried no hostility. It simply allowed honesty to arrive first. Richard carefully placed the cardboard box on a nearby chair. "I owe you an apology," he said at last. His voice lacked the confidence that had once filled every boardroom. "Not because you became my superior. I should have apologized even if we had never met again." Naomi listened without interrupting. Richard lowered his eyes briefly before continuing. "Yesterday I looked at your uniform instead of your character. I judged your worth before I heard your words. There is no excuse for that." The room remained still except for the distant sound of traffic drifting upward from the streets below. Naomi walked toward the large window overlooking the Chicago River. Sunlight shimmered across the water, scattering bright reflections against nearby buildings. "Do you know what surprised me most?" she asked softly. Richard shook his head. "It was not what happened in the restaurant. Unfortunately, I have seen similar moments before." She turned to face him. "What surprised me was how many employees believed they had to stay silent because they thought no one important would ever listen." Richard absorbed every word. Naomi continued, "Leadership is not measured by the people who agree with us. It is measured by the people who feel safe enough to tell us we are wrong." Richard slowly nodded. For the first time in many years, he realized that authority had surrounded him with agreement, but separated him from truth. Naomi picked up a thin folder resting on her desk and extended it toward him. Richard accepted it cautiously. The cover read, "Executive Leadership Development Program." He looked up in confusion. "I thought I was leaving." Naomi offered a calm smile. "If I believed people could never change, there would have been no reason to conduct this evaluation in the first place. I am not interested in replacing everyone who has made mistakes. I am interested in discovering who has the courage to learn from them." Richard looked down at the folder again, his eyes lingering on the title before quietly closing it against his chest, understanding that the greatest opportunity he had ever been given was not another position of power, but a chance to become the leader he should have been all along. Over the following months, the atmosphere inside Whitmore Technologies began to change in ways that no quarterly report could fully capture. The transformation did not happen through dramatic speeches or expensive consulting programs. It happened one conversation at a time. Naomi Carter walked the hallways every morning instead of heading directly to executive meetings. She greeted receptionists by name, stopped to thank the maintenance crew before the offices opened, and regularly shared breakfast in the employee cafeteria rather than dining in the private executive lounge. At first, many employees assumed the new chief executive officer was simply creating a positive first impression. By the third month, they realized it was not a performance. It was simply who she had always been. Richard Whitmore accepted his place in the Executive Leadership Development Program without complaint. The title on his office door had changed, and so had his daily routine. Instead of leading strategy sessions, he attended workshops focused on communication, emotional intelligence, and organizational trust. He listened far more than he spoke. During one session, every participant was asked to spend an entire workday shadowing employees whose jobs often went unnoticed. Richard requested the restaurant where everything had begun. Daniel Brooks welcomed him with cautious professionalism. The familiar dining room looked exactly as it had that evening months earlier. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath warm lights. Soft piano music drifted through the air. The only difference was the man standing near the service station wearing a simple black apron instead of an expensive tailored suit. Richard spent hours carrying trays, refilling water glasses, clearing tables, and quietly observing the pace that servers maintained without slowing their smiles. He quickly discovered how physically demanding the work truly was. Every detail required attention. Every guest expected patience regardless of circumstances. By late afternoon, his feet ached, his shoulders felt heavy, and he had developed a new respect for the people he had once overlooked. During a brief break, Daniel handed him a glass of cold water. Naomi always checked on every new server before checking on herself, he said with a thoughtful smile. That is why everyone trusted her. Richard looked across the dining room, where employees moved gracefully between tables. I never noticed, he admitted quietly. Daniel nodded. Most people did not. The best leaders usually do their greatest work when nobody is paying attention. Those words stayed with Richard long after he returned to headquarters. Weeks later, Naomi invited department managers to the auditorium for the company's annual leadership gathering. Employees from every division filled the seats, from engineers and accountants to custodians and cafeteria staff. For the first time in company history, the front rows were not reserved for executives. Everyone sat together without distinction. Naomi stepped onto the stage without dramatic music or elaborate introductions. Behind her appeared a simple photograph of dozens of employees smiling together during a volunteer event. Success, she began, is not measured only by what we build. It is measured by how we make people feel while we are building it. The audience listened in complete silence. She continued, every person who walks through these doors deserves the same respect, whether they wear a business suit, a security badge, a maintenance uniform, or an apron. Richard sat quietly among the department managers rather than on the stage. As he looked around the room, he noticed something remarkable. No one seemed concerned about titles anymore. They were listening to a message that belonged equally to everyone. The applause that followed was not loud because people felt obligated. It grew naturally, carried by genuine gratitude. Richard joined in, his hands moving slowly at first before the sound around him became impossible to resist. He realized that the strongest organizations were not built by leaders who demanded admiration. They were built by leaders who gave respect first and allowed trust to grow from there. 1 year later, the headquarters looked remarkably different even though the building itself had not changed. Morning sunlight still poured through the same walls of glass, reflecting across polished marble floors and filling every hallway with a quiet warmth that employees had gradually come to associate with a fresh beginning. The reception desk greeted visitors with genuine smiles instead of rehearsed formality. Executives paused to hold elevator doors open for interns. Department directors regularly shared lunch with technicians, assistants, and custodians. The culture Naomi Carter had envisioned was no longer a presentation inside a boardroom. It had become the ordinary rhythm of everyday life. On the first Friday of October, the company held its annual Employee Appreciation Day, an event that Naomi had redesigned around one simple idea. Every leader would spend part of the morning serving the people who usually served everyone else. The executive dining room remained closed. Instead, long tables filled the central cafeteria, decorated with autumn flowers, handwritten thank you cards, and photographs celebrating employees from every department. There were no reserved seats. Everyone entered through the same doors. Richard Whitmore arrived wearing a neatly pressed company polo shirt instead of the tailored suits that had once defined him. Around his waist rested a simple black apron. In his hands, he carried a tray filled with fresh coffee, fruit, and warm breakfast sandwiches, carefully asking each employee whether they needed anything else before moving to the next table. Some of the newer hires had no idea who he had once been. Others remembered everything. They watched quietly as he greeted each person by name, listened without interrupting, and thanked every member of the cafeteria's staff before beginning his own shift. Daniel Brooks had been invited from the restaurant to attend the celebration as a special guest. As he walked through the cafeteria, he noticed Richard placing clean plates onto a serving station with the same attention he had once expected from others. Daniel smiled. "Looks like you finally learned the job." Richard laughed softly. "I am still learning." The answer came without embarrassment because it was true. Across the room, Naomi stood near the windows speaking with a group of interns about their career goals. She wore the same quiet confidence she had carried since the day she first entered the building in an ordinary server's uniform. One of the interns asked what the most important quality in a leader should be. Naomi looked around the cafeteria before answering. She watched engineers laughing beside maintenance workers. Accountants shared tables with security officers. Executives carried trays while receptionists relaxed and enjoyed breakfast. Then her eyes settled briefly on Richard, who was helping an elderly janitor carry a stack of dishes without realizing anyone was watching. A gentle smile appeared across her face. "The best leaders never forget what it feels like to be overlooked," she said. "When you remember that feeling, you naturally begin to see people differently." The young interns quietly nodded. Outside, golden leaves drifted across the sidewalks lining the Chicago streets while a cool autumn breeze stirred the flags above the entrance to the headquarters. Inside, sunlight reached across the cafeteria floor until it reflected softly against a familiar silver nameplate outside the executive offices. It read simply, "Naomi Carter, Chief Executive Officer." A few feet away, another office door remained open. Richard was no longer the man who believed authority came from power alone. As employees slowly returned to work, he paused near the entrance and looked back one last time. Naomi was helping collect empty trays alongside everyone else, smiling as naturally as she had smiled during her days in the restaurant. No speeches followed. No dramatic music filled the room. Only the quiet sound of people treating one another with dignity remained, and in that peaceful silence, the lesson that had transformed an entire company became unmistakably clear. True leadership had never been about the chair at the head of the table. It had always begun with the simple choice to respect the person standing across from you.